We'll kick it off with some intros here. Good morning, good afternoon. For those of you on the East Coast, Keith up in New York, and Grant and I here in Texas. I am Ben Witten with Placer. I head up real estate strategy for the real estate vertical here at Placer. And I'm joined by Keith with the Real Estate Board in New York and Grant with Woodmont here in Dallas. Thank you guys for joining. Would love to, if you wanted to share a quick snippet on kind of who you are, what you do, and that would be awesome.
Sure. Keith? So I'm Keith DeCoster. Hello, everybody. Great to be here. I'm Director of Market Data and Policy with the Real Estate Board of New York. We're a trade organization that has been in operations for well over 100 years. I've only been with Rodney for 2 of those years, but in my role, I head up our real estate research studies related to housing market, commercial real estate trends, and also policy issues. But pleasure to meet everyone.
Yep, and Ben, again, appreciate the time consideration. Grant Gary with the Woodmont Company, as he noted. Woodmont Company was started in 1980. We are a full-service commercial real estate firm. I've been with the firm for 15 years now. Headquartered here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. As I said, really full-service commercial real estate. We've got 3 primary divisions: private company development, brokerage, and then an asset management, property management division. Today, we operate portfolio, predominantly retail. We've got some other office assets. We've got some industrial assets of about 25 million square feet across 36 states. We have offices in California, Arizona, and Florida as well. So we're certainly again appreciative of the opportunity and look forward to the discussion today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both for being here. I was excited to have you both on board because I think the topic at hand is pretty holistic, and really what we continue to see just with mixed use and the integration of different asset types, the lines are more and more blurred all the time. And I think, Keith, your perspective in New York, and Grant, your perspective of the Sun Belt, and everything will be really interesting. So thank you again for joining. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you.
Awesome. So here's kind of a quick overview of the agenda. We kind of went through some intros. We'll talk about office, just kind of the status, where we are, the trends we're seeing, some of the challenges, maybe some of the opportunities as well going forward. Same thing for residential, some of the migratory trends we've continued to see, through the pandemic, and talk through some of the long-term, short and long-term implications of those trends. And then at the end, we'll open it up to Q&A. So I would love to, make this interactive with the group. If you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can as we wrap up. Awesome. So a quick snippet on Placer, if you're not familiar. So, Placer is a mobile location data and location analytics platform. So we provide location insights for any physical location in the US. And similar to a statistical survey, we're aggregating data and extrapolating to provide insights on who's visiting, who's shopping or going to the office or migrating, right, where they're moving to from, and demographics, psychographics, all sorts of other data that can be combined with that. And so, we're taking raw data, we're analyzing it, we're debiasing it, and we're providing insights on all sorts of different trends relative across the commercial real estate asset types and spectrums, from crime data to planned development to foot traffic trends, you name it. Kind of a glimpse of some of the insights, right, you can get from the platform, but trade area analysis, competitive insights, visibility into the customer journey, where are they going, before and after, competitive benchmarking, cross shopping, how are they arriving, looking at different traffic routes, for site selection and the like. So certainly a number of use cases there, but just kind of a quick smattering of a few of those features. All right, so let's dive into it on office and kick it off with just a high-level view of return to office trends, right, compared to pre-COVID, compared to Q4 2019. Keith, I'd love to start with you and get your take on, do you think the office recovery is likely to continue, or have we found the new normal in terms of office utilization?
But, I think that's a great kickoff question, Ben, because that's how Real Estate Board of New York became a subscriber to Placer, and how we started. Collaboration is to answer that question in terms of what is the return to office. I do think that eventually we do push back closer to pre-pandemic norms. As long as you don't define the recovery as a 100% return rate, I think that we're in the recovery camp. That said, it's going to take us a while to see this trend line that you have here pick back up again, and building visits could decrease before they improve. Certainly we have some economic headwinds to face. Hopefully those are short-lived. Tenants are likely to shed space as they relocate and renew. But long term, I think the office setting to businesses is too core to their competitive edge. It's too integral to keeping their company culture. So I think that's why the long-term outlook for office is to push back towards that recovery. I think the hedge on that is the hybrid work model. That seems to be a fixture, and until office buildings, provide something like childcare, or until commute times fall drastically, I don't see hybrid workplace going away. So if you define recovery as 80%, maybe we'll get there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's consistent with what we're seeing. Grant, from your perspective, what, if anything, could landlords, office owners do to maybe accelerate that trend or help to push a little closer to more full recovery?
Yeah, well, and I'll just say this. I mean, I agree with Keith. I think from a totally new normal, I don't think we're there completely from an office space, and that being the medium for a work environment going away completely. I still think there'll be geographic considerations. When you look at different geopolitical factors, I think that's going to drive, the acceleration of what the new normal is for some markets versus others. So I think that can't be ignored, in a lot of instances where I think you're not going to see some of that recovery as quickly, and maybe not to the same, pre-pandemic levels that were noted. That being said, ironically, Keith touched on it. We actually do work with a childcare group. I think you're going to need to see a change in the amenity set, and I'll just say, inherently real estate's always evolving. So I think this is just one more of those periods of evolution. You went from, everyone having the dedicated, fully screened offices to the open office concept to kind of somewhere in between. And I think this will be another one of those periods of having to make adjustments into who is, and that's what you guys do at Placer, is a great job. Who's the customer? At the end of the day, what are they wanting out of the workplace? And I think that's the first question you have to answer, is what is driving it. But I think when you look at what Twitter's done, when you look at what the rideshare groups are done, I think you're going to continue to see these bigger companies, taking harder lines of bringing their teams back into the office. So then it becomes, what is the amenity set? And in a lot of cases, you have to look at economics. I mean, you can't ignore, and I'm sure we'll touch on it, what it's going to take to be competitive in an economic environment. Because in a lot of cases, the office setting is not as important as a retail setting and co-tenancy and things of that nature. So you have less ammunition in some cases, other than economics. So I think that the amenity set, understanding truly who the customer is and what they're looking for is one of the keys of getting people back and keeping them in the office.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you both alluded to it, spoke about just like, childcare, right? And I think through the pandemic, and Grant and I, we both have young kids, right, at home in preschool or pre-K. And it's, that childcare piece is so critical to being able to go into an office, go into a workplace, or, having the flexibility to pick up kids or drop kids off at school. And so you start triangulating, factoring in proximity to home, proximity to kids' schools or kids' daycare. And that calculus seems to be more important than it ever was before, where it was, I had to be in the office, black and white, no holds barred. Now there's definitely more fluidity within, day parts and all those pieces. So certainly a dynamic, landscape, no doubt about it. I think this slide's pretty interesting. We looked at, just the number of visits, into Manhattan for employees coming in. We looked at it, across the income spectrum. And it's been interesting to look at, sub-market level, zip code level, the disparity in return to office based on proximity, based on income levels. And, generally what we've seen is that, these longer commutes, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, have been an impediment to return to office. The income piece, there's also seems to be somewhat of a bifurcation of maybe there's certain higher income workers have more flexibility with remote work or hybrid work, whereas, more service or industry workers have to be, need to come in and that kind of thing. Keith, would love to hear your perspective on maybe how you guys are thinking about that in New York with different stakeholders of either getting folks back into the office or encouraging, hybrid functionality. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting slide. I think you're talking about essential workers, service workers during the pandemic. Those folks couldn't work remotely, and worse yet, some of them have multiple transit hubs that they have to work go through, and so they had 2 or 3, whether it's bus to subway, then to back to another bus, depending upon their commute. So transit is very, very critical. What's interesting is if you look at the term Midtown Manhattan, this may seem obvious, but when companies do studies on location, I used to work for a brokerage firm that did a lot of those. They would do these complicated analysis of, where is the center point, the best, most convenient location for most of our employees. They ultimately concluded time and again that for most of them, that Midtown Manhattan at that point in time, just because it's literally, at the center point of, if you look at New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut. I think that is shifting a little bit, if you look at Google on the far west side. But again, another example that's pretty much dead center just on the west side of Manhattan. In terms of changes, it's going to be interesting to see if Brooklyn and Queens, can take over some of those office locations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to that end, this is one of the studies I was alluding to before, right, where we looked at employees by zip code, and we looked at foot traffic trends for employees compared to pre-COVID. You can see, like, within Manhattan, there's certain zip codes that are doing quite well, that are very close to or actually above pre-COVID levels. There's other zip codes that are lagging for employee visits. And taking it a step further, what we've seen is that the comparison of short, medium, and long commutes really play out to where you've seen for Manhattan at large, those long commutes, in this case 10 miles or greater, those employee visits are down 45%, whereas those employees commuting shorter distance, 2 miles or less, are actually above pre-COVID levels. And so, not surprising probably by any means, but kind of being able to contextualize proximity to the workforce. And it's certainly dynamic zip code to zip code. You look at 10011, where you've got Chelsea Market, you've got Google's got 2 offices. Their high income employee visits are actually above pre-COVID levels, a little over 9%. So it's I think it's super interesting. This is the kind of stuff I nerd out on, just on what people are doing and trying to get to kind of the why. But thinking about just commute distance, I mean, Grant, kind of what's your perspective on, commute distance, proximity to employment? Does it affect either from a retail or an office standpoint, how you're thinking about strategy or how your clients are thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think you absolutely have to think about it. I mean, when you look at, just take Texas here, for example, so many of these communities, the Friscos, the Planos, the Richardsons, that have landed, if you will, these large, massive corporate relocations, they've been able to build these campuses and then build, frankly, affordable housing in good communities with good schools in close proximity. So, I mean, I think you can't ignore, that commuting component, the affordability component when looking at relocations. Just to step back for a minute, Ben, I think something to me that would be interesting to see from a data set perspective is, those office users that are single office locations versus multiple office locations, especially across multiple states or even multiple countries. I think when factoring that return to work, to us, that seems to be a big driver. Is there a company that's trying to set a policy across the board that is dealing with so many different regulations from a government perspective? And I think that's when looking at kind of going back to the geography is another factor. But yes, I mean, for us, looking at the commute times, looking at where they're going before and after work too. I mean, when you look at those data sets, where do they like to shop? Where do they like to eat? It's those factors, those intangibles that contribute, in addition to what that return to office looks like, in addition to the amenities and some of the things we've touched on.
Yeah, definitely. You kind of alluded to it, Grant, but like the regional disparities are significant. And Keith, I'd love to get your take on this. You think about, kind of the dichotomy or the tale of two cities between, New York and San Francisco. There's clearly been a very wide range in outcomes in terms of recovery. What is it, or is there something inherent in New York you think that has helped or accelerated New York's recovery compared to other markets like a San Francisco or others?
I think it's the corporate base, the diversity of different industries that still feel like they have to have a presence here in New York. And that may sound surprising when you read headlines about businesses that are moving a part of their operations or some of their employees to lower cost markets. But New York has really done a good job of retaining, major headquarters, particularly if you compare it to, 70s through the 90s, where, there were just waves of corporate exodus. And, so why are these businesses staying here? It's because people actually want to live here. A lot of younger people, despite the elevated living costs, the apartment market is as tight as it's ever been because a lot of younger people want to live here and they want to work here. And that's, a part of the mix of, of corporate retention that has helped us recover. We're basically 1 month away from recovering all the jobs that were lost during the recession, and that really speaks to the city's ability to keep its businesses.
That's pretty amazing. That's to think that it'll fully recovered from a job standpoint is that's pretty powerful. I know.
I would just point out that, they want to live here, they want to work here. They may not necessarily want to go into the office, 5 days of the week. So, that's why we're having this conversation, right?
Definitely. How much do you think, I mean, does one thesis I've had is like, does living quarters size have to do with it, right? Like if you have a tiny apartment in Manhattan and you just want to get out and be seen and get out of the house or get out of the apartment, like how much is that a driver of just a mentality, or just maybe it's like the desirability of and the amenities of New York, it's vibrant, it's walkable, when I was there, a couple months ago, it felt very, normal, close to like what it would have pre-COVID.
Yeah, I mean, you walk around on the streets and compared to, what was really scary, certainly 2020 and early part of 2021, the energy on the streets is amazing. And, just to share an anecdote, I had a niece several years ago who's moving to New York, and their actually plan for an apartment was really just a series of twin mattresses along the floor for multiple folks. So I mean, the living size is a little bit different than you would encounter in the suburbs, but there's so much to do and experience in the city, and that's part of what brings folks back to New York.
Yeah, definitely. We've gotten a few questions around just kind of like days in office and some of the trends we're seeing around weekday visitation. That's at a macro view. It seems like Tuesday to Thursdays are definitely the bigger days in office. Tuesday seems to be the highest traffic day. Is that consistent with what you guys are hearing and seeing?
Yeah, Tuesday through Thursday.
Yeah,
I would agree.
My question is like, what happens on Monday and Friday? And if we're pushing everybody in Tuesday, Thursday, we're just creating more traffic, more congestion. Can these businesses that depend on daytime pop, like, can they survive on 3 days? Are we doing ourselves a disservice, or should we think about allocating? Company A takes Tuesday, Wednesday. Company B takes Thursday, Friday.
Well, I'll just say this, but I mean, if you look at your chart and you look at, San Francisco and LA, two almost there at the bottom in terms of still recovering, look at the health of their retail on the ground floor of those office buildings. I mean, it's at the lowest occupancy rate in probably 20 years. And, I think that's the answer to your question, in my opinion, is no. I mean, without some reset of the economics, 3 days a week of 60 to 70% of your office, max occupancy is not what's going to be sustainable to drive that additional amount of foot traffic. Again, without some other change, either in the economics or a greater increase in non-office workers being present in a lot of those jurisdictions. I mean, if you look at some of these areas, there's other factors when you look at homelessness and some of those other challenges certainly that have to be addressed, but those are all contributing to factors moving away from the sustainability of what I'll call the ground floor space today, at least in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally and real world observation, I saw a headline last night, Nordstrom's closing another store or stores in San Francisco, and they're attributing it to just deteriorating, conditions and crime and the like. And it's a tough, reality. Those factors, seems like start to become a self-fulfilling prophecy in some way. It's hard to reverse those negative trends. And I think, looking at kind of a more macro view, we've looked like here, we're looking at trends in retail, dining, and office. And in some ways, they certainly seem to move together. And obviously, you've seen elevated recovery in office start to kind of stabilize. With some of the higher inflation, you've seen some pullback in retail, certainly. But there's appears to be, which makes sense. People are out of their house, going to the office more. Maybe they're more likely to shop on the way home or eat out, right? They're more likely to patronize coffee shops versus make coffee at home. So there's definitely this concept of like an ecosystem where people being in office is a good thing for cities. It's good for the tax base. It's good for probably mental health, right? I mean, there's a lot of positives of getting folks back in the office in some capacity, like you said, Grant. I think the limited utilization of 2 or 3 days in a week just doesn't seem sustainable for submarkets and nodes that historically have been so dependent on daytime population. It seems like there has to be some sort of other stopgap or use maybe to repurpose some of that space.
Yeah, I mean, it points out the value of having more residential. There's just so many different impacts, on the tax base. We did a study a couple of years ago, looked at retail wages, the salary for folks who work in retail in Manhattan pre-pandemic was close to 20% above what it was in the boroughs outside of Manhattan, just because of the confluence of all the different events, conventions, and when you transform that, that has a big impact on those employees.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
I was just gonna add to that, and it's maybe just a good segue anyway. I mean, if you look even here anecdotally in Dallas, where we sit today, or in Deep Ellum, I can name probably 10 restaurants in less than a 1 mile radius that have opened in the last 2 months, which would be somewhat contrary to the slide you just had up there from a dining perspective. And I think, again, as Keith noted, at the same time, we could probably note as many multifamily projects that have gotten started or that are under construction in that same vicinity. So I think, residential is one of those huge factors, in part, separate and apart, that I think is and has the ability to be one of the key drivers of sustaining some of the challenges that are being faced from a lack of people in the office.
Definitely. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. It's been amazing, like where you guys are in Deep Ellum, just to see everything that's happened with all the new restaurants and bars, and what historically has been a pretty high crime ridden area. Growing up in Dallas, we'd go to shows in Deep Ellum, and you definitely had to watch your back. You probably still do, but it's become activated throughout much more day parts, like weekdays, and people actually want to work down there and not just go down there on Friday or Saturday night, and they want to live down there. So it's been pretty cool to watch play out.
No question. Yeah, and we think it'll continue.
Definitely. So based on some of the trends that we're seeing, and we've talked about some of them, but related to like this slide speaks to kind of migration trends. We talked about return to office. How do you think about some of these trends and the long-term impacts, and how do you think about, are they long-term, or are these kind of short-term anomalies? Let's talk about migration specifically, like where people are moving and mobility as it relates to choice of where folks want to live.
You want me to jump in there, Ben?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So, I think, again, when you look at, I think we can all name and see it on the maps that you've got here, where this migration's occurred, whether it's Texas, whether it's Phoenix, whether it's parts of Florida, it's parts of Tennessee, that whole area. Some of the North Dakota is somewhat of a surprise, frankly, even though we've been active there in the shopping center business. But, I think the big drivers, in a lot of cases, I think certainly you can't ignore workforce, number one. Where are the jobs that are driving so much of this population growth? I think then you start to look at what's the affordability of housing, what's the availability of housing, and in a lot of cases it's schools. We spent a lot of time talking about kids and childcare, and that being an amenity and one of the options to get people back to the office. The school districts are a major factor, I think, in where not only companies, but where the individuals, and then you get all that follow-on migration. And then I think when you see, in terms of, is this, somewhat flash in the pan, or is it here to stay? I think when you look at just the pure numbers of influx of net new people into a lot of these areas, they still need all those services. So, if you go into the front lines of, the Orange County parts of Florida, or the Chandler and the Gilberts in Arizona, the Friscos here in DFW, there's so much housing, and really you have so many services that follow on to having that much housing, both single family and multifamily, that I think you're going to continue to see that growth occur, just because I think you have, a 3, 4, sometimes 5-year backlog of needs of services to meet all that housing that's coming online.
Yeah, definitely. The flywheel, right, of population growth. We need more housing, and then all the ancillary services and skills, right, needed to support that. Definitely.
I just jumping, adding to what Grant is saying. I definitely agree that you have states and areas in Florida and Arizona and Texas where those are long-term, growth areas. Looking at the map, North Dakota and Vermont, I think, are examples of movements that, were directly tied to the pandemic, and, folks wanting to take advantage of not being, anchored to a particular area because of their job and remote work. kind of disconnected them from that anchor. You've seen a fair amount of movement back though, from Vermont and North Dakota back to, where those folks came from. So you kind of have to separate the short term from the long term. There's no question, Florida, Texas, those areas, lower costs are long term, net influx of folks.
Yeah, definitely. Grant, we talked a little bit about Deep Ellum, which is obviously super urban, becoming even more urban and densifying on a consistent basis. For Woodmont, what you guys are doing, has your strategy shifted more suburban or more urban, one way or the other? How do you think about that?
I hate to keep coming back. It's a great question. I think in a lot of cases, it's still for us operating across, really almost the entire country. It still really becomes what are the demographics, what are the geopolitical considerations. I mean, you look at, again, you take a Deep Ellum, you take some parts of Miami as an example that are more of these high street opportunities. Where in a lot of other markets that's been challenged, they have so many other factors that are driving, tourism, that are driving, conferences. When you look at the hot tax and the hotel rates that are here, you're bringing people in, for more than just their traditional day-to-day living. So I think when you have more than just one or two historical key drivers of an area, that is something where we're looking at, where we're focusing. But at the same time, I'll say there's a lot of suburban growth, and that becomes a little bit product type specific. But just going back to what we were talking about, there's so many needs where you have all this suburban growth, and really not to kind of circle back to you guys and what you're doing, but there's so much data available today. I think to look at historically, looking at traffic counts, looking at demographics, that's no longer how we evaluate an opportunity. You have to go to such a deeper level because you truly understand who the customer is and where are those psychographics, what are the trends. So to me, it's still both, Ben, but you have to take in a lot more consideration of factors before making some of those decisions. Yeah, and I'll just say in some of these, we still think long term, even when you have an area, as we talked about, again, to come back to Deep Ellum, that has some challenges, when you look at its positioning, barriers to entry, we think there's some great real estate opportunities over the 15, 20, 50-year timeline, even when you are going to go through some of these periods of disruption.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like mixed use was big before the pandemic, but it seems like mixed use in walkable districts are maybe even hotter than they've ever been, just because from a employment standpoint, from a recruiting and retention standpoint, like folks want to be in a hot, vibrant district where they can walk to coffee, walk to the gym, walk to lunch, meet a buddy for a beer after work. Like that seems like it's become top of mind and more important than ever. And JLL did a study a few years back on the rent premiums that are supported in mixed use assets, right? The multifamily rent premium, I think there's like a 30% premium. The office premium, when you're stacked on top or adjacent to mixed use, really critical. So and from my perspective, it seems like that's an accelerating need, or there's those types of assets are even more desirable. But is there any contrary view or contrarian view to that angle? Agree, disagree?
The only thing I would say, by and large, I agree. I mean, it's amazing in a lot of these areas. I know we're talking a lot about office, but you look at those areas where they have that amenity set that exists today, they're still talking about new ground up office buildings. I think majority, a lot of parts of the other country, they're saying, what do we do with all this office space? Yet we still have areas that are building new office. I think, to me, maybe the contrary, Ben, that where you don't have it is, where you have a very strong economic incentive base, and while those amenities may not be there today, if you've got a Taylor, Texas with Samsung, or, take what Tesla's doing in Austin, some of these areas where they're going out, and truly developing this small community that doesn't have the amenity set because they've got that strong economic incentive base and because they're bringing as many employees. I think that's, to me, somewhat more the contrarian, where, they know what they're controlling from a large company perspective, and they're going to drive that opportunity, less about, the office space.
Yeah, build it and they will come, or we have enough critical mass to move the needle. We'll just, right. Make it
Which is
happen.
very rarely the case. I think the common misconception on mixed use, at least in the first phase or the early phases, was, well, if I just stack a bunch of apartments on top of retail, that's enough to support the retail. And I think when you look at that, by and large, and historically it's not that.
Right.
I think for certain uses it can be, but I think across the spectrum, just the apartments, when you look at how many actual residents are there, take that number versus how many need to go into each shop every day, that, if you really deep dive
Do the
back
math.
to those
Yeah.
numbers, it doesn't work. So I think you can't always, take to build it, and they will come approach, like many times have been.
Well, I think you made a great point, because like a lot of municipalities are pushing for X amount of retail on the ground floor, regardless of if there's a market for it or the space is needed, right? Just because it adds I guess the perception of vibrancy and walkability, right? And it works great when there's demand and users to occupy the space, and enough, surrounding residual demand in the area. But yeah, to think that the residents above are going to support those businesses and be enough is probably not the right approach.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, go ahead, Keith.
sorry, Grant. If you look at areas like Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue in New York, which is obviously different from the suburbs, but it was, traditional glass and steel and, traditional corporate setting, even pre-pandemic, those areas kind of were losing, the startups and the tech firms, because they didn't have that vibe. They didn't have the energy of the nightlife, very corporate, and things, shut down for the most part. Once workers, went some other part of the city, whether that was Brooklyn or Flatiron, where they lived, and went at night and out at night to to play. And part of the revitalization of Fifth Ave and Park Ave is to make them more walkable, and to have kind of the interactive, immersive retail, which is a real change for those areas. But I think it really speaks to how prevalent that model is, and how the latest generations, are really demanding that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, another little nugget on migration. We dove into some of the data and have looked at what percentage of the population is migrating in or out of a market, positive or negative, and we've compared that to basically the origin to destination income. So meaning, are people moving in from higher or lower income areas? And generally what we've seen is that these markets that are seeing this high growth, those people are moving in from much more expensive, less affordable, state income tax, kind of the classic, maybe New York City to Orlando or Tampa, or LA to Phoenix. That seems to be a trend that's continuing, and maybe the ongoing inflation and just housing affordability, right, it's become less and less attainable. And so, well, I guess to be determined, right, if that continues, will folks continue to migrate as a result of that search for affordability? What do you think? Do you think affordability continues to be kind of the hot button, or do you what else? I mean, we talked about schools, we talked about employment, definitely.
And I think affordability is a key driver, certainly, of why folks move from New York City to Florida. Major life events, whether it's loss of job, or moving back closer to family, or retirement. And if you can't address issues like housing shortages and other affordability issues, then you're likely to constantly have to deal with those outflows. One way New York City has regained some of its population is immigration, though. So it's a city like New York City, LA, other cities that attract a lot of people from other countries. So that compensates for some of the movement.
Yeah.
The
Definitely.
only thing I'll add to that, I think just briefly, when you look at, the affordability factor, yes, in a lot of these areas, they're coming from, higher, more expensive real estate. So they have more disposable income from a ability to purchase a house. But at the same time, I think there's been this proliferation of multifamily into the suburbs. I think so often, the multifamily product was in, the urban areas. That was the model. I think when you look at today, you have a lot of suburban, very nice multifamily properties that are adding a layer of affordability that are continuing to drive that growth, even into the suburbs, and then you add in the build-to-rent model of having a single family there. So I think there's continued to be, this real estate drive that has added to the option of affordability. And then I know we're not going into multifamily deep, but at the same time, you look at the amenity set of these communities and what they're offering, whether it's, from a co-working standpoint or from another amenity set standpoint, I think that is another factor that can't be ignored in a lot of these areas and the multifamily that's being built today.
Yeah, and I think the point you made about schools really resonates there too, because oftentimes, not always, but great schools can be found in the suburbs, and multifamily has historically had high barrier to entry in a lot of the suburbs, NIMBYism and other causes. And so what has that done with the high barrier to entry and the desirabilities, caused rent growth to be pretty exorbitant, especially in the last few years. And so
there was, I just have to say a quick aside. I was having lunch with one of the heads of an extended stay hotel brand yesterday. And I was blown away. Again, this is anecdotal, but he said that in some areas that have the best schools that either have, very high barriers to entry from a cost of housing or lack of availability, there's literally families that are staying in these extended stay hotels, and they've got buses that are coming through, picking up. I just couldn't believe it. But I think just another, driver of what the schools are doing and bringing families into those communities.
Yeah, can't underestimate the value of good schools, no doubt about it. And I think to that point on residential, you think about this is kind of fun. Just some of the psychographic data we pulled in, like behaviors and attitude, where it's actually looking at people that are interested in doing DIY projects, right? And so here we compared Houston and Austin. We looked at Home Depot stores in the city, urban parts of Austin and Houston versus Texas overall versus the suburban locations. And you see a pretty wide disparity in the number of percentage of DIYers, right? That are obviously, if you're Home Depot or you're Lowe's, those are going to be your core customer, of a good chunk of your customer outside of pros, right? But understanding what's the ratio of sorry about that, of DIYers and site selection. How many of my target customers are out there? And I think to that point, where you have this suburban growth, you have a lot of new homes, you have a lot of, first-time home buyers and folks that are, starting or growing their family. And I think you can't emphasize the value of data to support these kind of decisions around site selection in a city, urban, or suburban environment. There's so many different ways to look at it.
That's a great slide. Very interesting. I mean, if you think of New York, obviously back to what we were talking about, young folks with an apartment and how they spend their dollar. Obviously, none of it goes to DIY. They also don't have vehicles. So, they have much more of their income that can go to a gym, or if they have pets, or, going out at night to restaurants. But very interesting data.
Yeah, I'd love to see a side-by-side budget comparison of,
Mhm.
25-year-old in Houston, Texas versus Manhattan. Would look very different. I'm
Yeah.
sure it's out there somewhere.
Yeah, no question. And really, I'll just say, the other thing that there's tremendous value is you can understand, you go to the cannibalization, understanding where the existing store base is, where they're already serving the customer, and then really being able to hone in on the real-time growth that's happening in a community, especially a lot of these fast-growing communities. I think the data, Ben, that you guys provide is invaluable, because the traditional demographics, have a date stamp to them versus in real time. And I think that's one of the true keys that sets you guys in this type of data apart from making those critical, for a Home Depot site selection decision, in a new market, Houston versus Austin.
Yeah, definitely. I know we're coming up on time here, so I'm actually going to jump ahead to some of the implications. What we've seen just through inflation, and I think maybe more interesting here is just the seasonality of migration and really the impacts that we see in some of these markets like Tampa or Phoenix. The snowbird effect is real, no doubt about it. And you've also seen with that population growth and net migration, a lot of outsized inflation or just pricing pressures, right? From having, population expansion and a lot of net migration from these, more expensive markets, especially. Awesome. A couple of the questions we've gotten, I think will layer into this pretty well. Keith, I'd love to get your take, just on the office of the future, but then also for existing office. A few folks have asked about, the conversion of existing product to residential and just some of the considerations there. I know you and I have talked about it, and you guys have a full-time resource, I think, dedicated to that whole topic. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, we have one of the leading experts who actually served on a couple of city panels in terms of advice for the zoning obstacles and many obstacles that would need to be overcome. One of the key ones is that New York City zoning to convert office buildings in many ways is determined by the state legislature. So it's not fully under the control of the city. So that's a big hurdle. And, beyond the physical and the economics of it, there's so much that would need to take place to see a lot of these buildings convert. In terms of the future of the office building, though, I think Grant, you're making the comment about the amenity set, and the most forward-looking office owners have done a great job of working with retail to really distinguish that amenity set. Things like top restaurants becoming part of like the tenant wellness package. I mean, we have Daniel Boulud and a couple of major chefs at new office buildings who are working, whether it's catering or, the tenant lounge that they're providing, dining experiences. And, when I came out of school and first started in an office, I was excited if my company ordered pizza. So, the amenity set has really been taken to a new level. And I think that's part of the solution, in addition to alternate uses, whether that's residential or maybe even, hotel in some of these office buildings.
And I'll just briefly add to that, I think it's important in a lot of cases, the retail is always the afterthought. Ben, you touched on it earlier. The city says, hey, we'll permit your multifamily, but we want you to put some retail on bottom. So, okay, great, we'll drop some retail in there. And there weren't those considerations, just of looking at it from the retailer's perspective. It was still a multifamily developer or an office developer just kind of dropping in some retail, and I think that historically wasn't successful. So I think, Keith, as you touched on, having that curation, understanding what the ideal dimensions are, how do deliveries work, how does the exhaust work, who are the right co-tenants, for that user versus just dropping something down there, I think goes a long way, of that office of the future. And you're starting to see that, as you said, you look at a lot of these other projects that have come out of the ground today, they have that sort of programming in place.
Definitely. And there's a lot of talk of this, office to residential conversion, which obviously is great when it works. There's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work in a lot of most cases. What other, what's the next best alternative? Grant, have you guys, from like childcare concepts you guys are working with, has the idea of going in an office building been brought up? Or conversion to medical office, or what other avenues are there that folks should be thinking about?
Yeah, I would say absolute childcare. I think historically the challenge of childcare was the playground by and large. Where do you put the outdoor play areas? And I think, in so many areas, you didn't have to worry about it. You could go to your traditional site, you can have your adjacent playground. But I think when you look at people wanting to come back into the office environment, for all the other factors that we've talked about, you're seeing playgrounds on top of parking garages, in parking garages. You're seeing some indoor-outdoor hybrids. You're seeing some rooftop playgrounds, obviously taking into account, all the protections for the children. But those are the things that I think today, then you say, okay, how can you program around those? Do you add, the swim school components, so that you're, adding some of those other layers in one area, that's catering to the parents, and then can you now put in the coffee shop and start to build these synergies around otherwise what those daily needs are in a traditional setting. I think the other thing you have to think about is parking. In a lot of these areas, people still want to drive. New York certainly are some exceptions in other areas, but in a lot of cases, you still have to take into account how does the parking work, and what are those ratios. But I think a lot of those you'll start to see. You can't ignore hotel. I think you've seen a pretty big hotel recovery that was already going into a lot of these office buildings, maybe not the whole, location, but I think that's another use that doesn't have as much of a lift as the residential conversion does, that, as you said, so many are talking about today.
I would just throw in there that in addition to childcare, anything to do with pets, it's just an absolute with a home run. Breweries that have a playground for pets, anything but pet psychologists, because we're spending more time with our pets presumably, so they're happier. But pets are we've seen every type of retail here around New York City, whether it's things like Bond Vet or pet playgrounds.
Yeah, we've got Mutt's Canine Cantina here.
Canine Canteen,
an active franchise. I did a deal with them in my former life, and it's great, Greg, 'cause it's a bar. It's got a great restaurant. You can turn your dog loose, meet other people with dogs. It's great.
Yeah.
A big consideration on the pet specifically, Keith, and you touched on earlier too, is the zoning piece. I think that's one that we've seen, we're starting to talk a lot about, but I think you're going to need to have support from, the jurisdictions for those uses, because historically those, especially pets, were one that were either SUP or CUPs required or needing a rezone altogether. So I think in looking at a collective movement towards evolving the office space, you've got to have the cities behind it as well.
Yeah.
You made an interesting comment earlier. Did I hear you that a zoning change to residential in New York has to go through the state legislature? Is that?
Yeah, certain portions of it, the multiple dwelling law, which again, we have one of the best experts as part of our team here at Real Estate Board of New York, but things like, can you have residential above commercial? I want to say has over 300 sections since they introduced it. Started out with far fewer sections, but it keeps getting larger and larger. So that is the legislature's has to approve that.
That's interesting. Well, I guess that will further complicates the conversation there. Interesting to see what happens there. We got a question about how many square feet you need for a rooftop playground. Grant, I think that's directed at you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It actually varies state by state, so it's somewhat surprising. You know, I think as an example, in California, you actually need more outdoor playground space than you do indoor space. I think they're at the highest in spectrum. So if you've got a 10,000 square foot childcare facility on the ground floor of your office building, you need approximately 12,000 square feet of outdoor play area. So that's the extreme, but I would say, you know, using that same 10,000 square foot example, it's usually 6 to 8,000 square feet. It really depends on what your occupancy is of the childcare facility, but that's a good rule of thumb. And then again, needing to have dedicated areas for certain age groups, and then certainly your vertical transportation to be able to get there if you're going to the top of the building or parking garage.
So a 25,000 foot floor plate, a quarter to half of your, give or take, something like that, if you're in an office building.
Yeah. The unique thing though too, when you get in some of these cold weather environments with converting space, you can have indoor play. So I think that's another area to utilize your basement space that maybe was underutilized or not utilized at all. We're doing that on a project right now in Chicago. And it was really a win for all parties. Space that really hadn't been monetized, or put to a higher, better use.
And I guess, Keith, now we have playgrounds for adults too, right? Like the Seagram building in New York.
Yeah, I mean, it's become building out a full floor with a wellness center and other amenities. We've moved well past just a foosball table. You have rock climbing. You have beer taps. It's just amazing what we're seeing. Even though we are cold weather, outdoor space, terrace, balcony, rooftop amenities are the most in demand right now, though.
Yeah, it makes sense. Folks just want to be outside, especially springtime in Texas, 72 and sunny right now.
That's great.
Not always the case, but we'll take it when we can get it.
Yep.
Keith, Grant, thank you guys both so much for joining. Really enjoyed it, and always enjoy hearing your perspectives.
Likewise, Ben. Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Enjoyed the
All
time.
right, folks. Thanks for joining. And if you'd like more information on Placer, you can find us at placer.ai. Have a great day.